Okay, welcome to this evening's Skills, Economy and Growth Scrutiny Commission. We're examining 3 areas this evening, specifically the voluntary sector, volunteering, and then we will be having an economic stocktake and then a specific review of the nighttime economy. All of these are in the context of obviously the enormous trauma of the pandemic that has swept over not just Hackney but the whole world in the last 2 years. I'll just go through some housekeeping and some formalities in order to be able to get on with the rest of business. I'm Polly Billington. I'm Councillor Polly Billington for de Beauvoir and the chair of the Scrutiny Commission. We are expecting Councillor Lufkin to attend, and we have Councillor Smith, Councillor Sharman, and also we're expecting Councillor Palace to attend virtually. I have received no further members' apologies. We have officer apologies, people who were invited but couldn't attend for clashes with other meetings. The Head of Community Safety Enforcement and Business Regulation, Jerry McCarthy, and the Strategic Lead, Policy and Strategic Delivery, Claire Whitney. If there are any further apologies, I'm very happy to take them at this stage. We normally allow about a minute for any urgent business that might be arising, but I think we know that we've got a lot on this evening, so unless there is something extremely pressing, please raise your hand physically in the room. This is the delights of hybrid working, or indeed, if you're virtual, I can see your hand being raised on the screen. We also have a minute for declarations of interest from any members of the Commission. Is there anybody specifically with a declaration of interest that is relevant to the agenda items of this evening? Excellent, that makes life so much easier. Right, so let us go to the main meat of this evening's proceedings. We are looking for we've got about an hour of our agenda to explore the voluntary sector. We know that this has gone through some kind of transformation through the pandemic, and we want to know and understand a little bit about it. We've got 3 presentations to go through. Be led by Sonia, who will introduce the item. Then we will hear from Tony Wong, the Chief Executive Officer of Hackney Centre for Voluntary Sector. Then we will hear from Lauren Tobias from Volunteering Centre Hackney, and then I'm looking forward to hearing from Euphemia, who is from Woodland Aid. We've particularly wanted to take evidence from a mutual aid group, as that is one of the significant developments through the pandemic, and want to understand what that has meant for volunteering in the borough and what kind of future that might hold for volunteering in the borough. So can I hand over first to Sonia to open up? I'm sure people who've given evidence like Sonia to this commission will be highly aware of the fact that in order for us to be able to fulfil everything we want to do, we like to be able to keep to time. So I want to remind everybody that the timings are quite important, and Sonia's got 5 minutes, and then we'll move on from there. Yeah? Thank you, Sonia.
Thank you, Councillor Billington. So if we could, Tracy, move to the 3rd slide, please. So I'm going to just introduce the framing, really, of this in the context of the pandemic, and then I'll come in at the end, so I won't take over.
That's great.
So the first thing to say is that the voluntary sector was critical to the emergency response during the pandemic. And that was both through what happened on the ground, the grassroots activity, the volunteering that wasn't particularly coordinated, and also through the collaboration that came together through the community partnership work that the council did initiate, particularly in response to the planning for the 2nd wave. And that was really about thinking, how can we move away from direct delivery of support that didn't seem sustainable to tapping into what was going on already, both to make the best use of existing resources and only really plug the gaps with additional resource from the council, but also to recognise that it's the voluntary sector that are there in the long term. and are embedded into communities. So if we were going to build a preventative approach from the outset into the way we responded to the pandemic, so we weren't just dealing with the immediate crisis, then we needed to make sure that we were valuing the voluntary sector from the outset. And then the other side is that we worked with London Community Response Fund, which were a group of funders who came together, including some local authorities, some philanthropic funders. And for those who came together, we were able to then pool our resources. So we freed up the council's usual requirements so that we could focus on the emergency response. And actually what it meant was that a good project that wasn't funded by one funder could be picked up by another. So it was a way of coming together. Now, this enabled organisations to continue to really support the most vulnerable to respond to the needs of those residents. But coming out of the pandemic, it's clear that funders who weren't on that journey and took a step back from the immediate pandemic response and getting involved in that have not got the same understanding that we're still in a crisis in terms of poverty, inequality, complex needs. These have only got worse, and therefore that is a potential threat to voluntary sector organisations now. I'm going to hand over to Tony and then Lauren and Euphemia, who will talk more about that.
Lovely, that's really helpful. Tony, are you okay and comfortable to dial in? You're speaking?
Yes, I'm here.
Lovely.
So I'm also joined by Jessica Lubin. So I'll take the first two slides and I'll hand over to Jessica, who's our Health Transformation Director within Hackney CBS. So can I go to slide 5, please? So yeah, just building on from Sonia's points really. I think during the pandemic, what we've seen is that recognition of the role of the voluntary and community sector. So through programs such as Hackney Giving, that we administer a grant funding program, we have been able to, the voluntary sector has been able to play its role. And what we've seen as a result of that is improved partnerships, improved relationships, particularly with the statutory sector, but also amongst itself within the sector, different organisations working together. And that's really been something that we've worked to build on and solidify with the VCS enabler work that we've been leading on. We do still see, however, that there is a concern around funding. So picking up on what Sonia was saying, I don't feel that the sector, the funding arena is quite ready for what's next. So yes, in a recognition that we are still in a pandemic, but some organisations are now wanting to think about how do they mobilise to deliver their services beyond the initial crisis, but as we emerge from, and there does seem to be a lack of opportunity in terms of funding for the organisation. So when I speak to organisations, there is still a big concern about their future and their financial stability, and that was the big concern that came out of our recent user survey. Can I go to the next slide, please? So whilst I think there is definitely recognition, partnership working, all of that has been positive. What we can't escape from is the fact that there is still increased demand. We've got a number of organisations that are having to support clients with additional challenges, particularly now, with the onset of fuel increase, the price increase with fuel, which has been further exacerbated by what's happening in the Ukraine. Mental health is a massive challenge, both for the communities that the voluntary sector are serving, but also for the workforce. Not forgetting that we are, within the voluntary sector, some of the lowest paid staff, and also trying to do some of the most complex work. So, it's a combination of being squeezed at every angle for the voluntary sector. So it's a big challenge, but I'll hand over to Jessica, who will take us through the next couple of slides.
Thank you, Tony.
Thank you. So what does the demand look like? There is increased demand. There is an increased level of poverty. There's increased health inequalities. There's increased food prices, increased fuel prices. We don't know what's going to happen with COVID next year. And we know that winter will be a tough time for lots of people. And in the VCS, we want to support people so they don't have to choose between food or fuel and being warm. There's increased mental health demand, which we're all aware of. People are presenting at a higher level of need. That we delivered, the HCBS facilitated the VCS assembly on emotional well-being, as emotional well-being and mental health is seen as one of the top priorities by the community. The increased demand that people are presenting at is challenging for VCS organisations. The VCS are part of the community, and so they always want to support the people that are around them. If someone turns up at their door who has no recourse to public funds, they will support them. That individual probably doesn't want to go to a statutory service. They don't feel like it's for them. So the VCS is acting there as a third emergency service, and they will not turn people down. Next slide, please. This increased demand puts a lot of pressure on our VCS. So what does the landscape of the VCS look like in the future? The future of the VCS, as has already been said, is very uncertain, crucially with financial challenges, which we know that the council is finding itself, and which has a direct knock-on effect on the VCS. The VCS needs stability, financial stability as well. Work as part of the health system, if it's trusted and enabled to do so, to be an active part of it. So a kind of call to action here is that the VCS needs long-term investment. The VCS workforce, as Tony said, are some of the lowest paid in the health system. They need financial stability themselves to be able to deliver the services that they are doing so continuously, to deal with their own personal food, fuel and poverty challenges. The VCS needs financial stability to be able to plan their delivery, their services, their organisation more than a few months or a year in advance. This financial stability will then help them have the biggest impact on their communities, on our community, reducing health inequalities, and making sure that the VCS is an active and equal and proactive part of our health system. Thank you.
Thank you, that's great. I think that was really helpful. I want to take all the presentations before we go to questions. So could we hear from Lauren Tobias, please, from Volunteering Centre Hackney now? Lauren.
Hiya. Can I have the next slide, please? So I'm just going to talk you through, I mean, a lot of you will know already that what we did and what was provided during COVID, but just for some who didn't. So thousands of residents signed up to volunteer within weeks, which was amazing, and nothing was seen ever like that before, but it was also a massive challenge. And this was, you know, it's provided, as we're going to hear, through mutual aid, and people came through us, but it was also through the existing community groups that have been there for a long time. People were just really desperate to help. And we saw people go out in all weathers to deliver food, prescriptions, medical supplies, but also to actually prepare food right across the board, all kind of culturally appropriate food as well. But new demands were arising all the time. And we worked very much in partnership with a whole range of statutory services, whether that was public health or whether the community partnerships with NHS, to deliver the Community Champions programme, vaccine stewards, logistics support. And we upped our own befriending service within weeks to go from 20 matches to over 150, which are most of them, you know, a lot of those matches are still in existence and still going, because the numbers of referrals, as you can imagine, as we've just heard, for mental health is just increasing and continually doing so. And there's very few other befriending services in the borough that are have open criteria. So we work very closely with the voluntary sector groups that were on the ground, that were responding so well, so quickly, to provide them with those volunteers that we had recruited very quickly to help with logistics support, driving, food preparation, as and when they were needed. But we also saw residents create their own projects, what we call social action, but wasn't ever used, you know, during the COVID pandemic, which was residents starting their own food pantries or digital sharing projects like Bridge the Gap. Lots and lots of people, you know, doing online exercise and entertainments, all sorts of collections, and they were done either on their own in their own area with mutual aid groups, or actually with existing community groups as well. Okay, next slide. So as I've said, what we did was, we set up this system very, very quickly because our existing systems weren't appropriate. We had to have new recruitment mechanisms, new matching mechanisms actually really, really quickly to be able to respond to continually emerging needs and work very quickly. And what we did is we worked very, very much in partnership, as I said, with the council and with other programmes. We also provide guidance and support to a lot of the mutual aid groups because so many of them were very varying in their knowledge or skills or expertise, as well as I said, these residents and frontline groups which were starting up all over the place on risk management or volunteer management best practice, but also with existing groups because so many, we all had to redeploy our staff. We all had to work very quickly while trying to deliver services, and so few charities in the borough, as they do all over the country, have volunteer organisers. So at one point we were actually trying to recruit volunteer organisers for our charities, and that unfortunately is a gap that still remains with the voluntary sector, because volunteer coordinators are never seen as an essential member of staff. But unfortunately, they are really needed to help support, recruit, and manage and look after volunteers who are the bulk of their resource and the bulk of the people actually delivering the services. Okay, next slide, please. So it was a massively positive. It was massively positive. There were lots of positives. We had huge numbers, as I said, came out to volunteer and share the skills. It's, we were so lucky. We see the massively good side of people who really, really want to help and do things to help their neighbours. And people were really desperate to be able to trying to do something. And half of the people who volunteered during that time had never volunteered before. And it was a huge bulk of people. So although it wasn't particularly diverse, the bulk of people were young, 25 to 44, the bulk of the people were white, but it was a client group, I'm so used to talking this language. It was a demographic who hadn't volunteered before, and we actually did want to engage. And as I said, as it says here, over 50% said they'd like to volunteer again. And a lot of people was the reason they were volunteering is because they wanted to engage with their community. A lot of those relationships still continue. People got to know their neighbours, and you'll hear mutual groups has massively happened. Very local volunteering. We've worked very hard to try and match people to deliver prescriptions and food, very much based according to their postcode. We did the same with befriending. So we tried to keep that connection going. And the focus on social action, as I say, brought about new projects. That's incredible because we've been trying to do this for years and talk about the skills that people have to support each other and work together across communities in a local area to provide services. Is not just volunteering is often seen as matching somebody to a charity role, and that it was way more than that during the pandemic and continues to be, which is about residents working together across communities to actually deliver a service that's actually needed. And I do think that what Tony said, there was a greater appreciation among the statutory sector of the role of the voluntary sector and the huge resource and assets that residents and volunteers bring and how quickly they respond. Okay, next slide, please. So just, yeah, a few challenges. It was, the speed at which we responded was great, and which the voluntary sector responded and residents responded is fantastic, but it can result in this phrase inequity of reach, because really, which was part of what I was saying, I think about possibly is what helped with the lack of diversity with the volunteering, is to really enable people from diverse demographics to really volunteer and share their skills and work together. You have to build relationships, which takes a long time, and you have to work with community groups on the ground to really help them to feel that they can trust you, and that to actually recognise, to help them actually give that support and to help that to happen. And that's just not just providing that with one-on-one, but it's actually about working with groups that are actually on the ground to help them to do that. And that does require resource. it takes a long time. There was a lot of focus, of course, on vulnerability. People were forced to isolate, which again resulted in quite a one-sided helping approach, which takes away from what I've just been saying about the potential for people to actually collaborate and share their skills together. And so it became a bit one-sided. And then just finally, the lack of engagement. As I'm sure you knew, we weren't impressed with all the national government volunteer recruitment campaigns, which are just not helpful because they're not working with local infrastructure. I know that's nothing that anybody can do here, but if you ever can influence national government in that front, that would be really appreciated. And then just finally, I have talked about the resource and time it takes to really work with people on the ground. But if we were ever needed to repeat such emergency support, this was all done through not just us, but also through groups on the ground and all charities redeploying existing staff. It wasn't done with any funding. And volunteer centres, I think, are often not given the recognition that we need, which is the fact that, you know, we provide such an essential infrastructure and resource, and the way that we impact on people's health and well-being, life prospects is huge. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lauren. That was really helpful. I'd like to introduce Euphemia Chukwu from Woodland Aid. Euphemia, you set up Woodland Aid, didn't you? Or can you tell us a little bit about how you did that and what future you see for that kind of operation?
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much, Polly. Yeah, so Woodland Aid was really set up from the very beginning when the pandemic first hit, and we went into lockdown. So we found that the established VCS groups that supported residents in Woodbury Down, you know, there were some people that were getting it, so we identified the gap with a lot of vulnerable, elderly, disabled members of our community that was not receiving the support. So we then went to set up Woodbury Aid to close that gap, and then providing cultural offers as well to the community. So we learned that the effect of the COVID, it really hit the residents here in Woodbury Down, severely impacting the high numbers because of the living in social housing and cramped conditions, complex needs and stuff like that. So the residents were already really experiencing food poverty before this hit. So we sort of started to provide for the families with SEND needs, single parent families struggling to meet additional costs on the children at home. And then, of course, the Black and ethnic minority residents as well, who were impacted due to high infection rates and deaths. Mental health needs were very high across there. So we just, that's really the reason we set all that up. And in just the demand at that early stage was just huge demands for the services. And we learned quite quickly that partnership working was very crucial for us at that stage. And it's really how we see it now, you know, in moving forward, that it hasn't really changed per se, because things are not getting any easier for people and living standards. When the pandemic, so it's like coronavirus is going away, but it's not, because the poverty and the needs of the people is still extremely high. And Woodbury Aid provide, in the height of the pandemic, over 3,000 meals a week at that time, and with the DEFRA funding that we got at that time of 4,000 meals. But we found that now everybody's going back to their everyday lives, but the need has not reduced. And then the needs of the community and thinking and moving forward, I believe that people will need our support more. We're hearing in the news, definitely food, energy prices, petrol, fuel, befriending services, which reduces loneliness. The people are stretched and very stressed to the core, you know, causing anxiety and stress, affecting their mental health, like Anthony Wong said, and also so we know that things are not getting easier for people. But for us to continue to provide what we need to do, it's funding. It's always funding. We're a grassroots organization. We reach out to the people that the well-established organization cannot reach out to. We understand them. They understand us. They trust us. And for us to be able to continue what we're doing, because we can't keep going without funding, we do need funding. And we're hoping that, there's a way that the government can see that the grassroots are quite an essential part of the VCS, and be able to support us, be able to continue to support the community. And the crucial part of the volunteering in terms of the skills and economic and growth, most of our beneficiaries from the early stages became our volunteers, providing good opportunities for them to gain new skills, as well as young people as well. I've had the same consistent volunteers throughout the past 2 years, still volunteering for us. Some of them have moved on from the experience and skills they learned from Woodland Aid to actually go into employment. 3 of them now actually are in employment. One particular one who has been unemployed for over 5 years, lacked confidence. But in a period of 2 years, they've volunteered with Woodland Aid. They've grown in confidence and learned new skills. That has actually gotten them a job this December gone, which is a great thing. And also the young people as well, that through the volunteer is able to now, has gotten work as well, which is great. So really in moving forward, it's just what we do is crucial, and we can't continue to do that without support from the government. And during the height of pandemic, the partnership work and the collaboration that we've done helped us to be able to sustain. But how is that going to continue now that things are going back to normal, but the poverty for the people is still there?
Thank you so much, Euphemia. That is such a strong message and really powerful, particularly your point about how the very nature of your organisation gave people the agency to be able to move on and get jobs, acquire skills and dignity through what they were doing to help their own community during that. It's really powerful. Sonia, you're going to sort of summarise overall before we open up to questions.
Thank you, Chair. So I think the first thing to say is that there is no going back to normal for the council and for the way we work in partnership with the voluntary sector. So the challenges that particularly Hackney CVS have played back are the community challenges. They're the same challenges the council faces. And much of that has been co-created with the sector, so we've taken on board their insights and impact. So that is taken as read. What we do with that is the challenge. So the first thing is that we want to continue to work with other funders to share our understanding, because those funders that don't work at a very local granular level do not have the same understanding that we are still in we're in a growing crisis, cost of living, and now the impact of global crisis and what's happening in Ukraine. The second thing to say is that the collaboration and partnership working during the pandemic has changed our relationship with the sector for good. We'd already anticipated this direction of travel, the voluntary and community sector strategy. We'd identified the need to work more on the ground with local organisations, understand the local ecosystem, exactly the point would be able, who really has the reach, but also change our funding relationships. We were already, when the pandemic started, able to flex and de-bureaucratise because we'd already started that process. We've just introduced a new funding stream that is about community infrastructure. So it's out at the moment, and it's about both locally based organisations and organisations that have reach to what we'd call communities of interest, different culturally diverse communities. And the point is to fund based on reach, not on project, so that we're trying to fund organisations who are good at reach, as opposed to good at filling out funding bids and doing a good project proposal. And then also this doesn't work if we don't change the way that the whole council and indeed the health system works with the voluntary sector and values the role that has been particularly been revealed during the pandemic. So then we are continuing to embed the approach, and I'll come on to a couple more slides, across the council. So there's that culture change. We have to see this partnership working as needing to be sustained through culture change. So next slide, please. Some live examples. We're currently embedding priorities for volunteering, voluntary sector partnership working and grant making that have come out of the pandemic. So an example being working with Lauren on the voluntary sector brokerage and what the impact could be moving forward, but also how we value the place-based work that has happened and how we might work together to look at what funding there might be externally to do that, as well as continue the brokerage and look at the aspects that Lauren's talked about, the dynamics of who volunteers, how we move to good health, how we move away from what we were in the pandemic. The Community Partnerships Network. So there's currently people working with the different food networks to look at how they can be sustained. Now, that is challenging for the reasons that we've heard with regards to sustaining our level of input and funding. But if we can get networks working together, then we can have a preparedness to then be able to draw in external funding and direct that to those who have the reach, as we did during the pandemic. There's also the preparedness for future emergencies. I think we will be in a state of, future uncertainty and crisis, and that needs to be a new normal. So how we were able to galvanise support in response to the refugee crisis quite quickly. When I wrote this, it was about Afghan refugee crisis. I didn't know there was another crisis coming, but we are doing some work around working with getting advice quickly to Ukrainian residents, for example. And then the wider preventative work is picked up through the poverty reduction framework, which is going to Cabinet next week, and picks up how we make sure that we've got that focus on the issues that have been raised today, the immediate impacts, whilst also looking at the role of the voluntary sector in long-term prevention and early intervention. And just to give you an example of how we can influence central government, we've recently got some funding from the Department for Levelling Up Communities and Housing to be able to show how we might be able to work better on a hyper-local, place-based way, working with people, but showing central government how they might work with us differently and how that some of their policies and ways of funding could be developed. So we're through to this. We've just put in a second stage business plan, but it does very much speak to some of the points about how central government policy could be developed to be more supportive to the place-based, community-based approaches and to really valuing the reach that there is. There are a couple more slides, but I'm conscious of time, so they're there more for information because the poverty reduction framework has been through separate discussion in Scrutiny panel and is in the public domain now as well.
Thank you very much, Sonia. That was really helpful. I'd like to open this up now to questions from the Commission. Councillors, if you wouldn't mind, if you can keep your questions focused and in particular, as much as possible, identify who it is that you would like to answer the question. I'll take the questions in threes because I think it's likely that you're going to want to have answers from more than one person at least a couple of times, and I want to be able to give people who have given their evidence already time to respond to those questions accordingly. So I'm looking for hands on the screen. Do I have hands in the room? Honestly, it's like being on Flog It. Do I have? No, I don't have anything in the room. So I'm going to go. Do I have anything in the room?
Yeah, but
Nick, I can see your hand. Councillor Sharman, please.
Thanks very much, Chair. And can I just say what a tremendous range of contributions
Really,
there have been. I'm really impressed with it. And can I also say that what's been said so reflects what we had in Hackney Wick, the response from the community and the work with the council workers in delivering to a whole range of people we hadn't had contact with, mobilizing a whole set of new people as part of it. So I think what's inspired me is to see that what I saw in Hackney Wick is part of a much more general movement. I guess my question, Chair, is that, and it has to be for both sides, because to me, these are new models that are emerging of how we work as a council, how the voluntary sector works. The traditional VCS, quite narrow organisations are now, as Lauren set out, becoming place-based volunteering. It's a very different VCS model. But mainly, it's a major change I think the council has to make from a model of doing for people to doing with people. And that is a major culture change. And what I've been so delighted is the response by council officers to that new, more flexible way of working. And I guess my question to Sonia is, and you made a very good presentation to the audit committee about this being the way we will do things generally in the service. This isn't just about a pandemic or an emergency. This is how we ought to be delivering services with people on the ground. And I guess my question is, have we really seized that in terms of a project? Because I can tell you, having been involved in it, making a major cultural change of this sort is enormously difficult. It needs sustained leadership, it needs new skills, it needs continual support for how it works. And I've seen a lot of very good stuff so far. What I haven't yet seen is the way that might be turned into that long-term culture change. And I guess to the VCS model, VCS colleague, what we found, and I think it's sort of reflected in what Lauren was saying, is how important what you might call place-based people and organisation is right at the hyperlink. It's what I started off the world in as a community worker in the 1970s when it was very fashionable. But and they disappeared because people wanted to focus on outputs in particular areas. What you're saying, Lauren, as I understand it, is actually you need to join people together at a very local level. And that is an overhead and it's hard to see how any one thing funds it. In other words, it's a community, genuine community work. And we're not well organized either as a VCS or as a council and a government to supporting that necessary networking. So I guess it's how we get and build what I would regard as essential, which are a network of local community workers that can sustain this across a range of services and throughout the borough.
Thank you very much, Councillor Sharman. Can I take any other representations from councillors? I can. Councillor Rose, do you want to go next?
Yep, thank you.
And then microphone. Sorry, can you put your microphone on?
Sorry, that's what I mean. There we go. Thank you, Chair. I just want to echo Councillor Sharman's comments. They were some really, really brilliant presentations about really brilliant work that's is going on. I've got a couple of questions, I suppose. I think from the Hackney Volunteering Centre and then and Hackney Council, it's sort of at the moment quite a lot of it is quite organic, isn't it, at a very hyper-local level. And do we think that it's quite patchy, or do we think there's a really good sort of spread across all the communities that need it? And I suppose, what's the vision for it? That's the kind of question that we want to get to. I think there's coming out of that as well. It feels like food is often at the centre of some of this, and as we go into sort of the next kind of year or so, I think we're going to be seeing as you've already referenced, a huge sort of challenge with many families being able to sort of making that choice between eating and heating, as we sort of talk about it. But food prices are also going to be going up quite significantly very quickly, and so is the preparation there, or are the sort of organisations working together to think about this across the coming year? And then I picked up on something that was sort of mentioned. It'd just be interesting to get. I'm sorry, I can't remember who it was at one of the first presentations. The majority of new volunteers were white.
That was Lauren said.
Lauren,
yeah,
which
really
is
interesting.
really interesting. And I wondered whether that was lack of engagement from other communities, or actually, I suspect possibly true, that actually the white community was probably less engaged in the first place than other communities. Quite a lot of hyper-local kind of organisations, certainly in Hoxton East and Shoreditch, are driven by some of our what we call ethnic minority groups, but in my ward, majority groups, but not the white groups. So I just wondered if there was any more sort of insight into that stat. That would be quite interesting to hear.
Thank you. I'm gonna see. Sonia, do you want to pick up first, and then I think we'll probably go to Lauren and Tony and Euphemia.
So,
I'm going to take that off.
So I'll answer Councillor Sharman's point, and then
sure.
Councillor Rose's point was to me. So in terms of the ways of working, so at the moment we have a dedicated capacity across my service and the change support team in digital that is proactively developing the change programme that is linked to partnership working. So it has been about working with a group of people, then scaling that up and scaling that up. So, but it has an element that's about resources. So the sorts of resources that frontline workers and then the management and leadership need. So, for example, making sure that everybody has the same information about emergency support. Yeah. And so so some of that's a digital tool, better conversations, but some of it is about actually getting people to learn together and then build those relationships. So training has a role, but actually the learning together and sharing has more of an impactful role. So our evaluators say, because all of this has been evaluated by University College London. So that's the first part, resources. The second part is about recognising that this way of working takes its toll. It's difficult to do. I mean, even before you start thinking about working with residents to meet all of their needs, which is ultimately why partnership working matters. Otherwise, it doesn't matter unless you're applying it to the outcome. But even if you just work out more externally and collaborate more, you've got different cultures coming together. I mean, organisational cultures. Sometimes you get knockback. Sometimes you have to try and pitch things differently. All of that is actually quite exhausting. It is. So having support, looking at the role of what managers need to do and testing that, but also the support that's available for frontline workers. And we've been testing that through peer support as a scalable way of working. And then the third is about like changing the ways of working by building out the partnerships that are needed. So there's the food networks that I've talked about looking to sustain. But part of the challenge, and this is very much what the chief exec is talking about, is how do we make sure that all departments are now working in a more collaborative way. So there are developments in other parts, and then it's about how we support the right frameworks for working in partnership with the voluntary and community sector. And I think that is my observation would be that is a change from pre-pandemic, when a lot more was held by one team and seemed to be the go-to team if there were issues that needed to be talked about with regards to funding or the survival of an organisation. So then how we embed that, it's not, it needs to be embedded into workforce strategy, but it also needs to be embedded into all the plans that are in development, so that so you've already seen how in the poverty reduction framework that then is embedded as a way of working that values the partnerships and collaborations and working with the voluntary sector. So there's been so much change in the organisation that I'm not going to give the full answer of this is the programme, this is what it looks like, but I'm just giving you assurance that right now it is a managed approach. There is an evaluative framework, and there are these three aspects to it that are being developed in tandem. So the second point about hyperlocal, really good point. So the first thing I'd want to say is that the place-based approaches, the focus today has probably been skewed towards food because of the question about the impact of the pandemic, and then wanting to build on what's worked and what's learned. But I mean, I mustn't, you know, be remiss of me not to talk about community champions, which has been led by Public Health, which has also been about, in part, a hyper-local way of reaching residents. Is it patchy? Sorry, so just to take a step back, so Pembury Children's Community, for example, was pre-pandemic, proved itself as a way of working during the pandemic, and now it's going into another phase. You've heard about Kings Park moving together, but I think, you know, if you talk another day, heard from Suzanne about the way that place shaping, you know, the direction, I think that it's gaining traction. Is there a vision behind it? Well, we're coming to the tail end of an administration. We've got new leadership, but also I think it will be important to be clear about the point of place-based working, because it's about place shaping, but it's also about a way of reaching residents who are most unlikely to trust and come through the council doors. So it's about making sure there's a clear policy, policy point, and so I think that's part of building the vision. But certainly there's methods that we can use to look at where there's more capacity and preparedness in communities, and where there aren't, and how we might be able to make sure that communities that don't have a local anchor organisation don't get left behind and aren't as well served. So there's methods, but there isn't a vision. You know, there isn't a community development, for example, plan, or, you know, so I'm not going to pretend that there's something that there isn't. Well, I think it's worth looking at, going back to the policy point, you know, the policy reason to do place-based work. The risk of having a grand plan is that you try to roll out the same model of a localised hub in every area. From the work that I lead, Kings Park Moving Together, Pembury Children's Community, working closely with the voluntary sector, I think what matters more is that we actually think about a community development approach within the way we deliver and develop public services, the way we deliver partnerships. And then we look at where there's a need to have a hyper-local approach. But yeah, I was conscious that the cabinet members might want to come in on this, because it's formative, you know, it's formative direction of travel. It's not
Could you just answer Councillor Grace's question about the demographics, the peculiar demographics? Lauren, do you want to answer on that particularly, or Sonia, do you want to?
Can I just say something first on that, yeah. which is that it was a risk we knew going into the pandemic, but it also was, as you say, we wanted to reach people who would not have thought about volunteering, whereas there are people in communities who volunteer and don't call themselves volunteers. So it was a risk we knew going into the pandemic, and I think that there is a difference between the demographic of those who were part of a formal volunteering programme and those who were volunteers. Coming out of the pandemic, what Lauren and I were emailing about in the run-up to this meeting was how we might make sure that doesn't get that doesn't get crystallised in this idea that there's a community that due to another, you know, exactly. the sort of philanthropy that's unhelpful, or and I think Lauren's talked about the way that the pandemic skewed things towards help and rushing in that way. So I think if there's a principle of good help and we need to really be inclusive, then there's a way of addressing that.
Thank you. Lauren, can I bring you in, and then I'd like to hear from Tony and Euphemia, if we can, just on the points raised by the councillors.
Okay, thank you. I'll just answer the last one very quickly. So the demographics, we don't know exactly why, and I mean, you can come up with, obviously, you know, other communities were very busy dealing with the actual cause, you know, the problems of COVID and isolation and all the issues that was causing. And I think that the majority of new volunteers weren't having to look after their families, and they were possibly be made on, what was that? What was the word? I can't remember the word. But they were paid not to have to work. I can't remember what was the word?
They were on furlough.
Yeah, there were loads of them were furloughed. There was also, Hackney also has a lot of people who were not paid, unfortunately, who are creatives. So lots of musicians, people who are working in hospitality, and a lot of people who had not volunteered before, and a lot of people who were new to the borough. But but there were lots of people volunteering who didn't come through our books, as I said, to existing community groups, or the mutual aid groups that we weren't necessarily recording what their demographics were. And of course, they were a little bit more, they were a bit more diverse. But it's not necessarily a bad thing. That's I think what Sonia is saying. We've been wanting to try and reach a lot of that population before. So, and it is recalibrating now. So, and with regard to the place-based working, so I think very much what Sonia says is what are we actually looking at when we look at place-based working? So we have huge diversity across the borough of groups like tenants and residents associations, people who deliver things in community centres, very small groups that are right across the borough, which are not necessarily recorded or known right across the borough. So there's a lot, and not necessarily known as a voluntary sector organisation. And the work that we do and what they do and the work that we do on our place-based projects are exactly what Sonia said, is to help reach people who are not necessarily engaged with community sector and who don't necessarily engage with statutory sector. So, but this isn't funded, so we get funding to work in two places through lottery funding to do resident-led Skillshare work, which is exactly what we're talking about, place-based work. We've also recently been funded by the CCG through primary care to do that model, but in GP surgeries, where we're trying to engage patients to actually share their skills with each other. And that has proven immensely successful because it's reaching people with hugely complex health conditions who are referred by GPs, and we're getting them to volunteer in their surgeries and to share their skills and develop projects with each other. So this has actually happened since COVID, but it's only where there's funding for that. And I think it just needs continual funding if you want to try and deliver this in every borough, because it takes a lot of time to work with residents. Not all residents, but residents who are mistrustful, maybe who really lack confidence, who have real barriers to wanting to engage. It takes a long time to help make that happen. I'd love it to be absolutely everywhere.
I'm just going to just move on because I'm aware of time, and we've got two councillors' hands up, including the cabinet lead. So I'd like to go to Tony and to Euphemia briefly to respond to the observations made by the councillors so far before I bring in Councillor Kennedy and Councillor Palace. Tony.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. So I'll just comment on the question around network. So through Hackney CVS, we have launched in last year our VCS enabler model, which does bring together all of our networks. We've got a number of networks which either operate to serve specific groups, communities identified by characteristics, or that work on specific health agendas. So, for example, it could be an LGBT special interest group as a network, or it could be a mental health group working on the mental health agenda. And then a top tier of that now that we've incorporated in this last year is a VCS assembly model, which is bringing together the whole of the VCS alongside statutory partners, alongside residents where it's appropriate, to kind of look at the broad issues that are impacting on communities on the sector, and co-producing solutions to those big issues. So picking up on the point about doing with rather than doing for, it's really about co-producing with all residents and VCS organisations who are closest to those residents to make sure that we are working in that way. So we are looking to develop that. We've just had funding for another year. We're looking to develop that for a longer term investment. And then I guess just picking up very quickly on the neighbourhoods conversation, we also deliver the neighbourhoods programme, bringing together, again, in the similar guise, residents, voluntary sector organisations, statutory partners, following a similar footprint to the primary care networks. So making sure that it's a real person-centred approach to delivering health and social care to residents, so that all services are joined up and there's better coordination. So yeah, in answer to your question, are we coordinating, are we linking networks? I'd say yes, we are.
Thank you, that's great. Euphemia, some of the things that have been raised about the importance of community organisers, community workers, the importance of those networks. Do you think what you did in Woodbury Down needs to be replicated, or do people need to do things in their own way when they meet a crisis like you met in Woodbury Down, in Woodbury?
I think every community is probably, special in their own way. The important thing is actually knowing your community and being embedded in your community, because when you are, you will know the needs and you will know how to respond accordingly. So that's really what we did here in Woodbury Down. We are embedded in our community and responded accordingly, listening to them and their needs, and then just delivering that. So that's really the best way, when they say experience is the best teacher. So it's really knowing your community and knowing how to respond to that. And for us, like I said, we saw the gap within our community. We identified that, and then we then acted on that. And then the success of our volunteering and the staff of volunteers that we had, but they were beneficiaries. And to empower them and for them to feel useful, they now came and started volunteering for us and continued throughout that period until they got a job and moved on. So that's the powerful part of that. And in terms of sustainability moving forward, and actually one, I can't remember which of the councillors that said that, but I can see is where they're live. And also, Lauren, what you said about the geographical side, I'm not sure. For us, is a mixture actually. So we had the elderly people volunteering because they needed to get out and couldn't be, didn't want to be cooped up. So it empowered them and made them feel useful. And then you had the people from the Senate, and they didn't think they can do anything, but they came, they can pack food, you make them feel good, and they volunteer, they feel good, and they got references to get jobs. And also the young people as well, with all the problems of mental health going on, they came and volunteered. But I suppose this makes it easier for me to get the young people involved because of my other charity, Fame Star Youth, but to get them all involved. And so we had a wide mixture, and the people from the BAME community as well. So it was quite a great mix of volunteers that we had.
Euphemia, I wouldn't underestimate the importance of what I sort of rudely call the connective tissue, which is people like you, because you can mention all of those volunteers as much as you like, but it's people like you that make those volunteers have the capacity to feel, they've got purpose, they've got dignity. There's one recommendation which should come out of this, is that we do value those people, because it goes to Lauren's point about volunteer organisers. People don't think they're important. And I know every time I get that email about the 3 rings and volunteering for the vaccination centre, it reminds me I'm part of a whole load of other people who are prepared to stand in a freezing cold marquee in a high vis vest trying to get people vaccinated. And that reminds you you're part of something bigger. So never underestimate the importance of what you did on this, Euphemia. I'd just like to bring in Councillor Kennedy, because he put his hand up first, but you're going to have to be short, Councillor Kennedy, because you're a cabinet lead, and Councillor Palace, and then Councillor Potter, and then we're going to sum up very briefly, because we've technically only got 2 more minutes. Councillor Kennedy.
You're on mute.
You're on mute.
I put my hand up because I saw you possibly disappearing down the rabbit hole of recommending that we have a grand community development strategy. Euphemia said absolutely why you shouldn't do that. Every community is special and unique, and actually you find through the own organisation or organic organisation within that community and what best serves it. And if you talk to Lola, the project manager on Kings Park Moving Together, she will say that's exactly what she's found in Kings Park, that it's got its own unique set of problems, and to make it a functional community you have to address them in a way that is unique and specific to Kings Park. And Euphemia, brilliant work, and there's a reason why we as a local authority gave Freedom of the Borough to Volunteer Centre Hackney, and you've heard that tonight.
Thank you so much, Councillor Kennedy. Councillor Palace.
Yeah, so firstly, I just want to do a big shout out to the Boiler House, to North London Muslim Community Centre and Clapton Commons, who are phenomenal organisations who are absolutely the epicentre of the response in Cazenove in my ward. And it was just, phenomenal to watch how that all came together. I think the groundswell that we saw was just unprecedented, and about how that can continue. I mean, I just watching how the mutual aid group kind of developed as I kind of saw it. Often there were pre-existing anchor organisations who did end up forming a very pivotal role in ensuring that the kind of the mutual aids as they evolved were kind of functioning. So I found with my work with resident participation that particularly in my ward, I'm just kind of using this as an example, that actually it's a ward that hasn't had that much engagement. And one of the things we've been saying to officers is about what can we do to kind of be an ignition point for engagement. So I understand what everybody's saying in terms of the place-based stuff and that it's got to evolve. At the same time, if there aren't those anchor organisations, I think that is difficult. And so I think my question to officers about how we can be that kind of ignition point, as it were, and what kind of within the council we do have, for example, resident participation, who are doing quite a bit of work around this. I'm just wondering what the relationship is between VCS and them, because I think you've got resident participation team, you've got housing officers, there's a structure there. And just my other point is about, is there any other
No, at Councillor Palace, it's 1 minute past 8, and I've got to get Councillor Potter in, and I've got to get the responses. So your point basically is, where you don't have social capital, how do you generate it fundamentally in terms of resident participation, and you need anchor institutions to do it. I'd like to hear from the answers, but let's hear from Councillor Potter now, please.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to come on to, Euphemia talked about the embedding, so I wanted to build on that, but also Anthony's role, when he talked about the neighbourhood conversations. As a member and a volunteer with Brownswood Mutual Aid, we found the neighbourhood conversations really useful. So I'd like to understand just kind of what we've learned from those and whether that model still exists. Because, I mean, the role of various groups getting together in an area to understand what each other is doing, what each other needs and how they can work together, I found very, very useful. So you could just give us an update on those conversations.
Thanks. Can I hear from Tony first on that? And then it would probably be useful to hear from Sonia in response to Councillor Palace's question.
So yeah, I mean, the conversations they are still continuing. So we started out with Ross Street Common as the initial pilot area, and then over the past 12 months, we've evolved that over the remaining 7 areas. I don't have details of the specifics that have come out of each of them because obviously they are unique. But I think the premise of what you've observed from your experience is a shared experience in terms of their usefulness, in terms of key stakeholders being around the table and picking up on other points that have already been made about the specific unique characteristics of each of those neighbourhoods and what their needs are, and being able to speak freely and openly with the key providers in that area it's a model that I think everyone supports and wants to evolve and develop, and that's the work that we'll be doing. What I can do, if you're interested, I don't know the name of the person who's posed the question, I'm happy to speak to the officer within my team who leads on that, and we can perhaps come back to you with specific information about what's come out of those, because I don't have that to hand myself. I'm happy to have that as an action.
Thank you, Tony. Councillor Potter represents Brownswood Ward, so specifically about the mutual aid of Brownswood Ward. Obviously, all the mutual aid groups, I think, it would be useful to evaluate those, particularly on where there is variability of sustainability and what might be the drivers behind the disparities in that variability and the disparities in sustainability. Sonia, would you mind responding to Councillor Palace's observations about anchor institutions and resident participation?
Just on mutual aid, Lisa Rain continues to lead working with mutual aid groups So I can take that away. We
That would
haven't
be really
stopped
helpful.
because of the pandemic, so there's still that relationship there. And so with regard to social capital and the role of councils and institutions, I think the first thing is to recognise that social capital isn't evenly distributed in communities. So that's the first thing, is to recognise there is an equality issue, because otherwise you just go with where the energy is and where the community activism is, and you'll see then that some places have, growing projects and whatever, and you'll see the way that's reflected in the public realm, if nothing else. That's the first thing, is to recognise that, because I think otherwise policy just sees any action as good, regardless of whether it's evenly distributed. Then in terms of what our role can be, my view is that having a coherent approach to working with the voluntary and community sector, but recognising that the voluntary and community sector includes the influencers on the ground, the people like Euphemia who actually know the people. So it goes back to what I was saying about pre-pandemic, trying to understand the local ecosystem. So having a strategy that recognises that for some people, that bubbling up organically of activity isn't going to happen unless you get to know what's going on in areas, and then you can build and add value to that. So it's a direction we're taking in the grant funding, the example I gave of the community infrastructure. But there is, there's more to build policy-wise off that, as we learned from the pandemic. And part of that, Council Palace, is about making sure that the work the way of work. It goes back to what I was saying about making sure that the focus on the voluntary and community sector is not seen as one team's work, but actually the different parts of the council that work with residents also see working with the voluntary and community sector as a way of being able to build social capital, not as a substitute, not that you've talked to the voluntary sector and therefore you've talked to the community, but recognising that there is that way of them being able to develop activity on the ground. I think that, if at another time you've got more opportunity to hear from what Lauren has, VCH has developed in terms of My Place, and now how that is being developed with GPs on neighbourhoods model. I think that is a really, really good example. And actually, maybe I should have said over to Lauren to answer that question. But we are really interested in understanding more of how that work builds that social capital equitably. And the partnerships with people and place bid, I mentioned the DLUP funding. That is a big part of the policy question, and Lauren is involved in that bid, and VCH for that reason.
Thank you very much. I'm going to wrap that up just for the purposes of time, but I'd just like to make the observation that this has been an extremely valuable session. I think everybody on the Commission would agree, not only because we've got some proper analysis from the front line and some real experience from the front line, but also an understanding about how something like a crisis can actually become an opportunity for strengthening the relationship between the local authority and those that dynamism that we've got in our communities, and where we can see where those gaps are and how we might be able to support them. I'd just like to make the observation from my perspective as somebody who got involved in mutual aid right at the beginning, is that harnessing that energy is one thing, and resisting the temptation to be really statist about things is another. And those are inevitable tensions within the kind of politics of an administration like ours. And I think actually, from my observations, we've handled that pretty well and come out in quite a good place in terms of the things that have been outlined this evening. But we will want to look at recommendations for what you do when there are gaps, when there are physically, geographically gaps in places where there's shortage of social capital, and where the biggest strengths are. I think what's really interesting is how much food has become a thing, and that's not just because of food poverty, it's because food is a connector, and also helps with things beyond the sustenance of the body, but also the soul. So I think we should work really well on developing that further in our strategy. Thank you so much to everybody who's given evidence on that. I know you will have homes and families to go to, so we will be very understanding if you want to sneak out either virtually or physically from the room. And we look forward to hearing more from you and the voluntary sector. Again, thank you again, everybody who's given their time this evening on that. It's been a brilliant, brilliant session. Right, me talking too much, so we're running over. So let's move on to economic stocktake and the nighttime economy. We have just under an hour to complete this. We are taking evidence from a range of people, and we're going to break it down into two halves. There will be a game of two halves this hour. First, the economic stocktake, where we will have a 10-minute presentation and 20 minutes question and answer, and the same for the nighttime economy. We've done that deliberately so that we can keep focused, that one doesn't override the other. Now, we all know about the unprecedented shock, etc., of the pandemic on the economy, so we're really looking to understand what we know about the economy before the pandemic, the economy after the pandemic, what the council has done through the pandemic to support that economy, and what we understand as a local authority about the impacts of those efforts. I think we can introduce that. I need to make sure I've got the right names in front of me. For the officers presenting are Aled Richards.
Not the economics to Kate.
No, I know for the second part. On the nighttime economy, I've got people in a slightly random order in front of me. Forgive me, Aled. Stephen Haynes, who is the Strategic Director of the Inclusive Economy, Corporate Policy, New Homes. I have Guy down here, but he doesn't seem to be here. Suzanne Johnson, Area Regeneration, and Michael Toyer. Yes, of the Economic Development Manager. So, Stephen, would you like to start?
Yeah, absolutely, Chair.
Again, as you know, I'll keep this strictly to time, so we've got until 20 past.
So Suzanne's going to run through the presentation with Michael. You're absolutely right, Chair. We're going to break it up into two bits, though. It's just worth saying that the questions that you very helpfully posed are applicable, obviously, to both sides of the. So we'll cover those in both ways. So we'll go straight into the presentation with Suzanne.
Yeah,
kick off.
That's fine. Yeah, so I've had a laptop malfunction, so I'm going to be looking at the slides on Michael's laptop.
Fine.
So
okay. You've got your microphone on, haven't you?
Yeah.
Good.
Can I just check?
Yeah, that's right.
Can I just check in terms of timing? So obviously, Aled and I are doing a kind of double act.
Yeah, you do from now until 20 past, then we'll do 20 minutes on the economic stocktake, and then Aled will take over and do the nighttime economy.
15 minutes, basically. Okay. Just give me a minute, I'll just bring the slides.
I've got them up on screen if you want.
Yeah, I just can't read that very well.
What about that?
Let's yeah, that's fine. I might just click through here. Okay, that's fine. Just can't look at everybody while I'm doing it, but that's fine. So next slide, please. That's just a recap of the questions asked. So thank you everybody for having us along, and Michael's already been introduced, but I'm sure you'll get to hear more from him later on in the evening. So this is just a quick recap of slides that I often show Scrutiny Commission, which you'll have seen before, but these are just the kind of business stats in Hackney. So 24,290.
This is the most up-to-date stuff. I'm just trying to think about like before and after, but this is the most up-to-date, yeah?
This is the most up-to-date, so the source is there, so that's Office of National Statistics, and there is always a lag, so it's last year's data. And we know, as we all do, that 98% of businesses in Hackney are small and micro, 90% are micro, and the number of high street businesses is based on a kind of business rates record count of up to about 3,000 retail, hospitality and leisure units in the borough. Next slide, please. Just again, this is one that you've seen before, and it's up-to-date stats on the kind of prevalent business sectors in the borough. So you can see construction, retail, accommodation and food services, professional, scientific and technical, property, business admin and support, arts, recreation, arts, entertainment, recreation, and ICT are basically, you know, Hackney's biggest sectors by quite a way. Next slide, please. Okay, so the slides are full, so we've tried to very comprehensively answer the questions that were asked. And I might not cover everything in the slides because I'm conscious of time, but all the information is there.
That's fine. What we're seeing here is that these are the data points you've got, right? Yeah. I think what's useful for us to know is how you use them.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So I won't run through those then.
No.
In terms of, we hold a lot of data in terms of our regulatory services. So I've listed there some of the kind of most common business data records that we would hold within our regulatory services. So you can see all those there. Next slide, please. And then just in terms, I might spend a bit more time on this because this is the ones that we actually probably use and use evidence from a bit more frequently. So in terms of other data on businesses and the local economy, some of that is set out below. I've kind of said there the list is not exhaustive because the list could be as broad ranging as we would wish it to be really. But I've listed there some of the key kind of areas of business and economic evidence base that we do have. So what we do have that's new is a huge raft of information on kind of businesses in the borough related to the business grants programme that we've been running. So we didn't have any of this data in this kind of succinct format before. We probably did have it in different areas, but as a result of the business grants programme, we've basically built a new IT system that businesses have had to interact with in order to get a grant. So in terms of that system, you've got the name and address of businesses, size of business, number of employees, business type, whether they're a registered company, whether they're a sole trader, whether they're freelance, whether a partnership, whether other business models are listed in there. We've got the business sector, what sector that business operates in. We know who the business owner is. We've got the business SIC code, it's called, which is the standard industrial classification, which all businesses are kind of categorised by government. We've got the business premises type. We've got the business rate status, whether they pay or not, and if they do, we know the rateable value.
Sorry, can I just ask a question different from the data that you presented in the table at the top? In terms of the nature and kind of businesses, it is.
No, it's the same information. So that information that I provided at the top is the Office of National.
So this is where you get. These are the data points that provide the information for that.
No. So I've listed the Office for National Statistics further down.
Yeah.
But in terms of the business grants data, this is data that's currently held in a new database that we've set up.
Right.
And at the minute, we are not using that data, other than we are literally using.
So below the Office for National Statistics, just for clarification, everything below that is yet to be used. Is that right?
No, that's not right.
Oh, sorry.
No. So the business grants data, the one that the first bullet point there it's just a new data set. But I mentioned at the start, some of that data does definitely exist in other places. But what this gives you in terms of the business grants database is, if you bear in mind the thousands of businesses that have been coming through our business grant system, we've asked them the same questions, and we've got it all now in the one place in terms of this information. In terms of the usage of that data, how we've been using it is literally at the minute to pay out business grants.
Right, okay.
That's been the absolute.
But that is a potentially rich source of
data
to understand better the economy. Right, that's what I wanted to understand.
Yes, which is why I'm kind of talking in a bit of detail about what we hold, because we've built this database for the grants, but it's a really useful source of data, and we will be using it. Priority at the minute is to finish paying out business grants. Next is Office for National Statistics, which I'm sure many people have heard of and are aware of. That holds a lot of information, numbers of businesses. That's where we get the data in the tables that I showed at the start of the presentation. Business size by number of employees, business types by that kind of SIC code again, business formations and closures, local employment per sector. The GLA have a London data store, so there's also some information in there around local economies, high streets, including some information about the nighttime economy in there. And then business survey data, we've done kind of 3 business surveys during the course of the pandemic, which really focused on what businesses' immediate priorities were as a result at different points in the pandemic, what support was needed by businesses, and what type of business support would benefit businesses in the future, thinking of a post-pandemic world. So we just did that survey just before Christmas to ask businesses, we as a council would like to continue supporting you if we can, financially and in other ways. what support would you most like to see from the council? So we've just done that survey and we're still actually analysing the results of that, so I don't have the results of that one just yet, but happy to share once we have done. We have an employment land study which we prepared for our local plan, so it's quite old now, it's 2017 because it was used to inform our current local plan. But that looks at kind of guiding land use proposals based on kind of, you know, requirements for commercial space, the amount of existing retail space and projected future retail and commercial space that we might need to serve the borough. And we also have different kind of subscriber lists. So we have the Hackney Business Network, we've got about 4,000 businesses signed up to that. Hackney Nights Portal, over 100 businesses. The Zero Emissions Network, we've got over 700 businesses signed up to that. And through those, we know a bit. I think in terms of the data we hold, I think the business grants data is the kind of richest, you know, most recent furrow to plough in future in terms of really good up-to-date information about businesses in the borough. Next slide, please. And how the different types of data on businesses are used. So that, I mean, regulatory service data is kind of used to manage fees, inspections, part of service and income functions. You know, I guess there would be limitations in this data because often it may be used to make an application and then not updated if a particular kind of regulatory application is not required again. So some info on there. The COVID business grants data I've already covered. We're still at the point where we're using that to pay out emergency COVID business grants. So at the minute we are not using that data. It's actually been used for an emergency funding programme. Government collected and held data. I mean, this is the Office for National Statistics, excuse me, and the kind of GLA data, and we use that to understand kind of wider trends and inform strategy development. Regionally collected and held is the same, and then we often do have kind of data that we gather in terms of commissioned research reports. So that kind of planning employment land study is a good example of where we would commission a specific report on an economic factor at one point in time.
Sorry, Suzanne, I'm just going to have to press you because we've run out to the 10 minutes.
Oh, right, okay. And then subscription lists, I think I've already covered. Next slide, please. This is economic support and what we've done during COVID. So listed there is all the grants that we've given out and kind of the sectors that those are focused on, which primarily have been accommodation, hospitality and leisure for the business rates related grants, but we've also covered market traders, nurseries and childminders, and generally any business in the borough that's suffered economic hardship as a result of COVID has been able to apply for a grant. The Omicron grants, I think I've mentioned before, we're currently giving out now, and then there's all sorts of other support like the furlough scheme, business loans, self-employment income support scheme. Next slide. And this is a kind of more bespoke approach that we've taken, which I think I talked about in the last session actually. So these are some specific grant programmes that we've used some of this COVID emergency government funding to run in Hackney, and they're all basically kind of either running or just recently closed. So these are kind of about to pay out and will be delivered up until December this year. Next slide, please.
And you have quantums on each of those funds, do you? How much money was allocated? Yeah.
And other support that we've given during the course of the pandemic, I mean, as a commercial landlord ourselves, who obviously manages properties, we've worked with businesses on a one-to-one basis to provide rent deferrals, rent reductions, in some cases writing off rent payments for our business tenants. We've provided support to businesses via business forums, kind of via the Hackney Business Network, social media channels, etc., etc. We've kind of done quite a bit of high street promotion, Hello Again Hackney campaign, My Virtual Neighbourhoods, lots of different kind of initiatives based on kind of high streets and town centres over the past few years. And yeah, I think we can go to the next.
I was going to say we just need to, because I'm conscious of time, and Councillor Pallas has already got his hand up. Councillor Pallas, is that an issue for clarification or a question afterwards?
It's a question afterwards.
Okay, thank you. I've got your noted, and then also Councillor Race. Yeah.
No. Thank you. This is actually one for Alice. Could we skip 2 slides because our presentation is joined?
Sure.
I'm on my last 2 after this. From Tracy, please. Yeah. And so the next one again. So I think, I mean, we've covered most of this in terms of data about general kind of economic and business data. A lot of the same applies to high streets. I guess we've got the GLA High Streets Data Service, which is part of that GLA data store, town centre health checks. We've got a retail study from 2017. Next slide, please. And then support to businesses and high streets. I mean, a lot of it is, again, what I've already covered around the business grants, business rates relief, and some of these more bespoke grant programmes that we've created that specifically focus on high street and town centre businesses. And I guess the key thing that businesses told us during the pandemic has been the most important thing to them has been financial support to pay their rent, to pay their bills, to effectively keep running their business. So, you know, that's what we've been focused on for the past 2 years, which is really getting the cash out to businesses. And we're still doing it. That's what I was just doing before I came here tonight. So
thanks very much, Suzanne. That's really helpful. I'll go to Councillor Palace first, then Councillor Race. Any other indicators now? Councillor Lufkin after that. Councillor Race. Councillor Palace, Councillor Race, Councillor Sharman, and then Councillor Lufkin, and then Councillor Sharman. Sam.
Okay, yes, very, very quickly. So diversity, are we collecting any data around that, around protected characteristics and businesses? The second point is just around all these grants, and I know all the phenomenal work you're doing, but are we seeing kind of underclaiming in particular kind of businesses? Are we seeing kind of grant which is not being taken up? And do we have an idea about why certain businesses may not be claiming certain grants, or are we seeing a big kind of take up?
Thanks, Councillor Palace. Can I take Councillor Race next?
Yeah, thank you. Incredible amount of data that we're able to collect. It'd just be useful to know over the last 2 years, so pre-COVID versus now, what's been the impact on the local economy in Hackney? I think last time we saw you, I saw the rest of the question around obviously lots of businesses being artificially kept afloat through sorry, Tracy, through sorts of grants and things like that. And so most of that support is now being withdrawn, or you said that there's some emergency support going out. So is there economic scarring? Actually, is the kind of, as the economy rebounded quite strongly? Like what's our view of what's going on in the local economy? Thank you.
Thank you. Then I'll go to Councillor Lufkin, then Councillor Sharman.
My question follows on from Councillor Race's actually. It's what areas are still kind of suffering. I think Councillor Race said what areas are still suffering from kind of economic scarring, and what can we do about that?
Thank you, that's really helpful. Councillor Sharman.
I thought it was a great review of what's happening, but there were no numbers. I'm desperate to see what we're putting out under each of these things, how we think it's going to be effective, and how we're evaluating them. Clearly, we won't get all the answers because some of the data is way behind, but I'm just a bit bewildered about how we're making the decisions about the allocation between these and what we're expecting from it, and how we will judge whether they're being successful.
Thanks. I mean, I'd follow up from Councillor Sharman. It's great to be able to see this number of data points, and we totally recognise that what your primary purpose has been is to get the money out of the door in order to be able to protect the businesses that currently exist. But I think, particularly for the purposes of an economic stocktake, we need to have a stocktake, which is an evaluation of where the economy is in contrast to where it was, so that we can see progress or regression over time, the issue of economic scarring, the resilience that we have been able to support, how much of that has been actually about us passporting government money through, and how much of that is about where we have made those bespoke points, which is revealed in here. But with this amount of data points, I'm really keen to see first session back really after May, and an economic evaluation of pre and post pandemic, and not just an evaluation of the economy and the businesses themselves, but also where and how we understand the impact of government action and Hackney Borough Council action in order to be able to support those businesses. If all we've done is manage to keep the number of businesses the same, that would be an extraordinary result. But at the moment, we don't know whether that's the case. I don't think. Certainly from so far, I don't think we do. And if we have managed that, I don't know how we've managed it. So I think those are the things we need to understand, because proportionately, for the amount of money that the council spends overall, this is quite a small budget, right? That's not passported through from national government or whatever. So we need to understand what the bang is for our buck, and how much we understand that passporting of national money through is done, and what its impact is. I think that's a reasonable sort of assessment from our perspective as to having all this data, right, is really useful. Now let's see what we know from it, what it tells us. Any further observations from the Commission, or can I go back to Suzanne and Stephen? Right, Suzanne and Stephen.
Yeah, sure. I'll answer a few and then I'll bring Michael in, because he's been doing some work on kind of impacts.
And not coming as well.
Coming as well, yeah. So I'll cover a few. I guess in terms of the Councillor in Billington, your point on, has the number of businesses changed or stayed the same? It's actually, I think it's increased slightly or stayed about the same between, so I showed that figure earlier, the first slide of the kind of 2021. And then if you compare it to 2020, it's about the same. So, there hasn't been a massive reduction in number of businesses in the borough. So, but I appreciate, you do.
We do need to be able to see that and present it in that way.
Understood.
2018, 2019, 2020, 2021, up, down, in, out, hospitality here,
Understood.
Whatever.
A
graph.
Yeah.
Well, believe it or not, the first time I made it into Hackney Gazette was when I said, don't show me a graph. And this time I'm asking you to show me one.
Now, the economic development function, as of about a month ago, the council didn't have an economic development function for a number of years. So we've created one on the basis that we do need to,
understand this.
And move on. So I guess bear that in mind. Michael's been here for about a month, and around about that time, and the economic development function is not fully formed. It's still got more staffing, which we are kind of working on, leading on, and it will be a fully formed team. But we are working on the basis that we've had no economic development dedicated team, and we have now got one. So that's where we're at in terms of the kind of resource element. Just to come back on the questions, Councillor Pallas on diversity. For every business grant that we give out, we ask businesses to complete a kind of equalities and diversity form. We can't force them to do it, so it has to be optional. But we do have some data from all those business grants that I mentioned, and also the kind of more bespoke business grants that we've created. We've not evaluated it because, again, come back to the point, we are still giving out money, and we have a final government deadline of the 31st of March to do that. And if we don't do it, give out the money by then, the government will reclaim it. So we must get the money out, otherwise we lose money, and the money doesn't go to businesses. So that's what we've got to do. That's what we're doing at the moment. In terms of underclaiming, I would, in terms of the main business grants, the issue has been false claims and weeding through piles of claims or grant applications from businesses who are not businesses. So we do not give out money to businesses that are not indeed able or should be claiming it. And that's what we've been working on amongst giving money out to, of course, legitimate businesses. So there's a lot of analysis required to make sure that we've not, and actually other councils have seen large amounts of fraud and paid out money incorrectly, and I'd like to think that our checks have been really robust, and I'm really confident in how we've been giving out the money to the businesses. In terms of, I think I can hand over. I think Councillor Sharman, sorry, I'll come back on your point. We do have, for each of the more bespoke grants, I've given numbers for the kind of main grants, as they call them, in one of the spreadsheets. I think in the previous session, I gave the numbers or the financial amounts for each of the more bespoke grants that we've created. They're not on this spreadsheet, but I can provide them. Again, in terms of how many businesses we're going to award each of those grant programmes to, we're still in the process of evaluating that, and they'll all be given out, like I say, back into the 31st of March date. And after that, we'll have full reporting and we can come back and share that information. But we are still literally giving them out at the moment. And in terms of kind of pre-COVID and now and the economy and areas still suffering, I think I'll hand over to Michael if you're happy to take that one.
Thank you, Michael. Can I just ask you just to have a few minutes, because we need to be able to move on to the nighttime economy question shortly.
Yeah, I'll be very short and just say something about data. So the government data can get us to March 2021, but the March 2022 data, which will be really important because of the point already made about keeping businesses afloat, etc., that's not going to be available until October.
No.
So we'll be able to get halfway. We've got some very good data on spend on our high streets, MasterCard, which is bang up to date. And we haven't got time, but it's a live dashboard, so you can basically see with each COVID restriction that comes in, spend plummets, but then it goes up. And those figures for Dalston, they've recovered spend-wise, and for Hackney Central, they've actually gone beyond what they were pre-pandemic.
On the high street?
On the high street, and there's a map of the kind of postcode points.
That's exactly the kind of stuff we want to see.
But it needs further investigation, because the Hackney Central one looks odd, because it's gone way beyond. And I need to unpick it. So I just want to say a couple of things on the kind of more technical side. Others might want to chip in, or I can continue.
Go on.
No, you're on your own.
I don't know whether you are on your own. Go on. I think Steve wants to say something.
Did you want to come on? You go for it. So one of the things that we want to have a good look at is we've got the government stats, the figures you saw up there, so 24,000 registered businesses, but approximately across the country, it's about kind of between 40 and 60% that are not registered. And the data on those kind of normally sole traders, one person operation, they're not registered for VAT, they don't do PAYE. The data is really sketchy on those, but there are huge numbers. And if we were going to look at gap filling our data, that might be something to take a look at in the future. So I just kind of wanted to say that, because I think that's really important in Hackney.
Yeah.
A lot of those people are normally in arts, cultural sectors. So I will stop there.
Thank you very much. Steve?
Very briefly, Chair, because I'm moved to Alan and colleagues. We haven't had the analytic capability in place to date. Suzanne and the team have done more in the last 18 months to 2 years than happened in the last 10 in terms of getting that in place. We have now Michael and his team on board. It is the perfect time to be doing what you're asking for. I completely get the point around comparisons and graphs and charts. And I'd like to build on the helpful discussion that you and I had, Chair, last week about how we can bring members up to speed in advance of the next session of SEG about what we're doing in relation to the economic development strategy, the outcomes and metrics piece, and the other things that we discussed. So absolutely. And Michael and Suzanne have touched on the comparison stuff. If you look at, just as an aside, if you look at PAYE on the payroll, there's been an increase of about 2.5% from November 2021 to pre-pandemic in Hackney. That's just that itself is an interesting statistic that we need to start bringing through with the work that we're talking about. And Suzanne talked about the 24,000 businesses or units in place this year. In fact, in 2019, it was stable as well. So it's not just the last 2 years, it's the last 3 years. Again, it's that sort of stuff that I know that you need to know. So we will take that on board and bring it back in the way that you and I discussed last week.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you. Are there any further questions before we move on to Alec and the nighttime economy?
I'd just like to comment, it's really reassuring to hear about the statistic development.
Yeah, that we're doing, that we're going to see that analysis, because I think the important thing for us is that we need to see it so that we can start interrogating it, understanding better, therefore, what the economy is that we're part of. I mean, this is the other thing, is the public sector doesn't sit free floating from the economy. It not only has a role to shape it, but it interacts with it all of the time. And we need to, I think we spent quite a lot of time trying to predict the future without the data to know what the current situation is, and without any benchmarking, we can't really do that. And with this kind of continual upheaval and turmoil, which Sonia was mentioning earlier, that we need to expect sort of continual economic insecurity to be the new normal, what that means for our residents and for our businesses and their survival will be important for us to understand as an authority. Thank you very much for that. That's really helpful. I think that's probably the context within which we hear from Alid, really. Alid, you've got 10 minutes.
Yes, I'll rush through this. If you can go back to 4 slides.
Yeah.
I have to here. I forgot my glasses.
Which slides do you need?
It's the number 11. Now. If you go back.
Backward. Yeah.
Another one. Oh, don't. And should be 4 back.
4 backwards rather than 4 forwards, Tracy. So back to page 11, I think.
Yeah, it's page 11 I need.
Hold on, let me stop sharing and get back
there. Anyway, as Tracy finds that, I'd just like to introduce Daniel O'Sullivan. He's the head of markets, award markets, national award winning transformation he's done. He'd be able to answer a few questions if anybody has them on the markets and the support we've done for the markets and street trading. Shall I just plod on anyway?
Absolutely. You keep going and we'll see where we get to. It's page 11, isn't it, of the slides?
Yes.
And that is page 33 in the agenda, I think we're looking for. But go on, Alan, do you?
Economy. No doubt, because the onset of the pandemic, all the clubs and pubs, they all closed down. The nighttime economy literally stopped overnight. We've been working as one of the main lobbying boroughs across London in order to get the Home Office to amend legislation to ensure that there is no requirement of some of the pubs and clubs to pay the late night levy. That's a levy which is paid by these establishments to help enforce a nighttime economy. The Home Office didn't amend it, the legislation, which is unfortunate, so we needed to take the initiative. So what we did was we looked at legislation to provide a reduction of the late night levy to premises if they adhere to best practice scheme. So in order to do this, we did the Hackney Nights accreditation scheme, which is our Hackney Nights portal, which is a one-stop shop for all the pubs and clubs to give them all the support and training required in order to deal with pre-pandemic, which had its residual problems of the new staff which were there. There was a staff shortage because of Brexit, because of the pandemic, and very inexperienced staff. So this portal used to give all the training and the links to all the other information and the COVID protection information available. So we work with Environmental Health and Public Health to deliver monthly advice sessions for licensee to help navigate the COVID restrictions, and also officers attended local pub watch meetings. We have a separate slide deck which I can share with Scrutiny after the meetings to just show what companies see. But it is a good initiative. It is seen as exemplar in London, and we've been working with Westminster to develop their own based on what Hackney's done. So it's been really well received. Now, in terms of the market traders and outdoor dining, Dan's been leading the way. The government ensured under the Business and Planning Act 2020 that you could get al fresco dining, and there was an onus on local authorities to expedite that process with a small fee, which was a challenge. We succeeded in that challenge. We were very proactive in allowing a lot of new tables and chairs outside. But also, we also, in terms of markets, didn't charge traders for storage, reduced fees, provided free business support, application form support, and other online activities in the markets. Many of the local authorities closed their markets altogether. We didn't. We kept Ridley Road, which is one of the most important markets in the borough for essential goods. We also created a simple COVID risk assessment interview and 6-point plan document to all returning licence holders so they could operate and open the businesses smoothly. And we also engaged on a roadmap, so we preempted what the government announcements were going to do and ensured there was a roadmap to give support to businesses with a COVID response team, which were made a multidisciplinary office to visit these premises to give them all the support they needed to open safely. If we go forward 2 slides, and that's number 5, it says 5 in the top. You'll see a lot of information coming in, data coming in now about the health of the nighttime economy in the borough. The good news is it's extremely resilient, and because of probably a young population as a destination area, it's bounced out really well back from the pandemic. It's grown from strength to strength. And a lot of the information we will get here, we will be putting it into the council statement licensing policy with a revised cumulative impact assessment of the night to study the nighttime economy, and this revised policy will need to be published by 2023. So we're quite happy to bring it back to this scrutiny. We've got a lot of information. We've got a requirement in the Licensing Act to keep a public register of licences. We have, for example, this is shown here, we were in March 2020, we had 1,149 premises licences, which is down from the previous year in 2019. One of the biggest problems we've had is that the licensing, regulatory services and planning were probably these services which were most affected by the cyber attack, which wiped out a lot of the data we had. However, we've been working really hard in order to get that data back in, and we'll be reporting again at the end of this month the number of licences we've got across the borough. And again, quite happy to forward that information to you. So the information we do have is the total new applications coming in. And in 2021, we saw business activity continue at a relatively high pace, which is 234 applications, which is approximately 10% above the 3-year average pre-pandemic. So it's rebounding out really well in the community. The level of new applications received has been quite consistent over the year. What we did see in 2020, though, and you will probably remember that summer, there was a lot of a crazy summer, where off-sales was allowed, off-sales alcohols was allowed. We saw a huge increase in the number of applications received. Unfortunately, a huge increase in antisocial behaviour as well, which we had to deal with. Temporary event notices is another barometer of activity, and they usually generally reflects the level of the activity and the health of the nighttime economy. Straight after the pandemic, not surprisingly, they dropped, they plummeted. However, we are seeing a good resumption of the number of TEMs we're receiving in at the moment, and a gradual increase in activity during 2021. What we're expecting is the number of temporary events notice we'll receive will increase quite a lot in 2002, probably aligned with the Platinum Jubilee celebrations and other World Cup, I think, as well. So we usually have an increase in TEMs then.
Just a note, Alan, you've got a couple more minutes.
Couple more minutes, okay. Yeah. I'm going to move quite quickly there. One of the areas of growth we've seen in the nighttime economy, and also links in with the economic development team, is the huge increase in the rapid grocery delivery services. We didn't have any registered in the borough at the end of 2020, but by 2021 we had 9. However, the competition now self-isolation laws have ended. Sector is becoming increasingly competitive, and it'll be interesting to see how many of those are operating in 2 or 3 years. Also, the squeeze the household incomes at the moment could affect these businesses. But I'm going back to the Hackney Nights now, just to say, because you're linking in with inclusive economy here. If you're looking at the Hackney Nights portal, and I'm quite happy to show it, you will see that it's a one-stop shop to give all the training, which is in the guidance and the required of the new companies. So, for example, when the pandemic reopened, what we were finding is that because of Brexit, as I said, there was an influx of inexperienced hospitality staff, and there was real big problems of reopening the economy. What we've done with the Hackney Nights accreditation scheme is to do online training for those staff. They would be able to do it, and they get the certificates, and therefore they get the accreditation afterwards, and a 30% reduction in the levy. What it also is very good at is because the courses are looking at increasing the inclusivity and inclusive of the nighttime economy. So a lot of the courses you will get there are looking at how to identify hate crime, how to identify substance abuse, how to limit violence against women. And also it comes into the sustainability criteria as well, and so they will sign up to having steps to actively reduce their environmental impact. And the well-being of staff is extremely important. There are training events within there as well. So once they do these training, they have a ream number of certificates, which then they can put up on their premises. So it's all online, and it really helps inclusive economy objectives, because it ensures that the nighttime economy is a lot safer than it was, and the businesses are bought into that idea. I'm going to leave it at there because I'm aware now it's probably just about running out of time.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. We're gradually getting people used to what 10 minutes sounds like. I want to open this up to questions from the Commission. I think we've got Councillor Race first, anybody, and then Councillor Lufkin, and then Councillor Palace.
I just wanted to, no, I didn't, no, that's your fault. I just want to start off actually by, I don't have any particular comments on the market service, but I just want to say thank you to everything you're doing, because certainly the market in my ward, Western Street, is going from strength to strength, and it's great to see, and people really value it, so thank you. My questions are around, just in terms of, I've got two questions really. So one, TENS. I noted that you referenced TENS positively as a positive indicator, if they're going up, of economic activity. I think that lots of residents and certainly councillors, including me, would object to that characterisation of TENS generally. I think there's, I would be interested to know your thoughts on the TENS were originally brought in obviously for Jubilee weekends, church balls, things like that, right? And they're now not being used largely for that. Certainly in my ward, they're being used for pre-existing sort of licensees who just want to, in the case of last sort of summer, have a big new place in a car park outside of their place, which right underneath people's windows. TENS, from my perspective, are a real problem. And it feels like they are used to circumvent the usual planning system, zoning licensing system. So I'd be interested to hear sort of thoughts on that, particularly around how you characterised it at the beginning. Just in terms of the COVID response, I mean, I think we got there in the end in terms of utilising outdoor space, but I definitely didn't get the feeling that we were quick off the mark. And so be interested, I'm sort of interested to hear what you were saying at the beginning there. Certainly, you and I had back and forth on Redchurch Street in particular, and I think that's probably slightly different because of the closure of a street rather than sort of tables and pavements. But I know that from the beginning of June, when the request first came in, there was a lot of back and forth, there was a lot of indecision about whether this was a thing or not a thing, and I think there was some political sort of, interventions there, and it eventually came in August. That was essentially quite a few missed months for elements of the Shoreditch economy that we do want to encourage. So, good restaurants that are sort of at a higher quality end of the sort of nighttime economy there. And so I wonder whether you think we have any terrible word learnings from that as to where to go next time, if indeed we need to do that in the future. I did note that obviously Westminster, through their bid, seemed to be pretty quick off the mark as to what they wanted to do, and I thought that we were pretty slow on what we wanted to do. We weren't too sure on what we wanted to do. So those were two points. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Councillor Lufkin and then Councillor Palace.
Thanks very much, Alan. Yeah, I mean, it seems that to me that the nighttime economy has really rebounded pretty strongly. I mean, I remember sitting in this committee, about a year and a half to 2 years ago, when people were thinking, is that going to be curtains for the large chunks of nighttime economy? And that just doesn't seem to have happened, really. It seems to have come back, well, just as strong as it was before. What is that? Do you think that's true, or and are there any areas that it hasn't? So is Shoreditch doing better than Dalston or something like that, or is it the same kind of results all over? And secondly, in terms of the things that we have done to encourage the nighttime economy, like for example closing streets, having more street food and things like that, is something that we can. Is that something that you would think that we could look to continue to strengthen our economy offer? Thanks very much.
And Councillor Palace? Sorry, and Councillor Palace?
Yes, so just picking up on something that Alice said about sustainability at the end. So, one of the big kind of emergencies we're obviously facing is around, the climate. And I was just wondering how we can kind of further the green agenda, as it were, through licensing levers, such as reducing plastic. And just to echo what Councillor Race and Lufkin are saying, we've obviously got a big agenda around 21st century streets. And really trying to push that, and just where you see the opportunities on kind of the outside dining, and to kind of to match what our aspirations are on kind of net zero.
Thank you very much, Councillor Palace, Lufkin and Race. Are you ready to ask anything, or shall we just take them? Right, okay, great. Can you respond, please, Aled?
Yeah, the concern with Thames would be a concern which is shared by a lot of my officers, because we have to deal with the implications of when Thames go wrong in the neighbourhood.
Can you put your microphone on, please?
Oh, sorry. What the reference to Thames was there, because it is indicative of the health of the nighttime economy. However, we do work very, very closely with the police. So if we think a temporary event notice is going to lead to antisocial behaviour, we will not approve it. But there has been an increase in the temporary events notices coming in, mostly because in many cases you couldn't go inside for a drink at that time, so you had to have al fresco drinking, which had caused its own issues, and anyone living around London Fields would be quite aware of that one.
Can I just ask a quick supplementary, just
Go
before
on.
we move on?
Your microphone on.
How many Thames do the team in Hackney Council or the police object to? Because you've got to act proactively object to them, right? Otherwise they just sort of go through it.
I don't have that information with you. I know last time I looked at this, it was about 15%, which was objected to. With the police or ourselves or our own licensing team, but that was probably last year, so I can get that information for you. Your second question was regarding al fresco dining. I think there's an acknowledgement, I think there's an acknowledgement that, we were a bit slow off the mark. We weren't as quick as, say, Westminster in Charlotte Street or Soho. However, I don't think we wanted to replicate some of the scenes we saw in Soho. So what we did was we were very proactive in actually approving them. One of the main problems we were having in approving applications were the quality of the information coming forward, but also objections from the blue light services, because they were coming close to allowing blocking and access to fire brigades to go down streets. So that was one of the main problems we were having, getting quick responses back from the emergency services, and especially the fire brigade, about needing access to go down some of these streets, because a lot of the streets around Shoreditch, for example, the footway and the roadway length would not allow it to be taken over by table and chairs. However, we have Broadway, for example, we did close that off to allow a bit more of an area to have table and chairs there. I'm getting old. Third question.
Just
can you put your microphone on again?
How it seems to me that things have really bounced back. Would you agree with that? And secondly, are there any areas, sort of Dalston or Shoreditch or anything is one area doing better than another, or are there any sort of points of weakness, really?
Yeah, the statistics we're getting from the number of licensing applications which are coming in now show it's rebounded out really strongly. One of the biggest areas where it's rebounded is Shoreditch. Dalston's doing very well. Unfortunately, Shoreditch has created its own problems. We're working closely with the police in order to deal with quite an incredible rise in antisocial behaviour there. But the police have now remodified their team, so we've got a much better working relationship with the police down in Shoreditch.
Councillor Palace.
Sustainability, yes.
Do you want me to state the questions again? Yeah. So the first one.
No, absolutely, categorically not. Thank you.
Good, thank God.
The accreditation scheme, we've done it in such a way that they'd sign up in order to get recyclable glasses and recyclable plastic, so everything would be recyclable. But we're also working with the commercial waste side and environmental services to work with businesses to increase recycling and look at the containers they're doing. So the environmental ops side, led by Sam Kirk, is doing a lot of work with local businesses in order to inform them on the sort of receptacles need to throw away. When they throw away, we can collect. So there's a lot of work to do with on the sustainability and of products which are like nighttime economy uses.
Can I follow up on that? Sorry, forgive me, I'm always a bit of a nerd on this because it's what I do during my day job. But beyond recycling commercial waste, which is highly important, and I'd be interested to know what is being done about giving the support to particularly hospitality for anaerobic digestion and so forth, which is a really important part of reducing the carbon footprint of food. I'm also interested in the air quality issue, particularly around those delivery services, both Deliveroo, Just Eat and the big brands, as well as other smaller services. What are we doing and how can we use the licensing regulatory powers that we have as a local authority to support cleaner, preferably zero emissions vehicles for those delivery services?
Very little under the licensing regulations, but we were the first in the UK to do the ultra low emission zone.
Exactly.
That was in Shoreditch for the Shoreditch nighttime economy. We are also working with some pretty big businesses at the moment to reduce the amount of deliveries they do in the vehicles and looking at the use of cargo bikes. We've rolled out cargo bikes, and we hopefully will have some pretty exciting news on some really big businesses who are really cottoned on to that, and those are down deliveries in the nighttime economy areas. So we're working closely on our transport colleagues to get sustainable modes of transport within there, and we are looking at other, let's not put the word LTMs in there, but we are looking at other interventions which we can do to improve the air quality and also increase the amount of air quality monitors we've got down.
Yeah, I'm just particularly alive to the safety around scooters, not only their air quality, but also their road safety and the threat to almost anybody who manages to walk about. Councillor Lufkin? Yeah, and then can I bring Councillor Potter in first before I come back to you? Councillor Potter, we're now on the last 10 minutes of the meeting, just to remind everybody.
Thank you, Chair. Very quickly, thank you, Tracy. Very quickly, in terms of going back to the TENS question that Councillor raised, so he did allude to the fact that TENS aren't necessarily being used for the way they were intended. Would you have any policy recommendations where we can address this as a local authority or put some pressure on national policy? And the other point I was just going to make was in terms of obviously during the pandemic and, we had the outdoors dining, I wondered how much part of as a local authority, we're really good about protecting our walkways so that they're not, so that people can get around and access them, people with mobility issues, etc. So how much did that kind of conflict with our policies to keep our pavements clear?
Thank you. And Councillor Lufkin.
Just on the issue of deliveries, it's great that in our low traffic neighbourhoods that electric bikes can go through the closures and that, internal combustion engine vehicles can't, and that should really give a competitive advantage to people doing it to people doing it in a sustainable mode of transport. So I think that's a really great initiative.
Thank you. Aled.
Yes, we are campaigning with the government because what's happened during was like a bonfire of the regulations when COVID came in, and some of the regulations which came in basically were taking away a lot of the bureaucracy, the red tape. Unfortunately, that had a downside in that it increased the amount of time where if you get a temporary event notice, it could increase the amount of time you could actually utilise that, with the local licensing authority have very little powers in order to curtail that. So we are going back strongly, and I think Darren's writing to the government. I think on the changes to some of the government legislation. I don't you want to come in there.
Yeah, so I'm part of a group engaging with government ministers over the potential permanency of the pavement licences. So there was due to be a parliamentary debate this month to make them permanent, because currently they expire on the 30th of September 2022. However, they have paused that now to engage with local authorities. Prior to it coming into practice, they only actually engaged with 2 local authorities, which were Westminster and City of London, both of which are 2 of 3 local authorities in London that don't use the LLA. Everybody else does. So they didn't actually have a view of how it would impact and affect everybody else. In regards to our licensing process under the Business and Planning Act, Hackney are one of only 3 of 33 London boroughs that haven't had a licence issued under tacit consent. So what that means is if you don't adhere to the very strict 10 working day guidelines that the government put in place, that licence is granted automatically. It's also granted for the full validity up to the end of September 2022. So to be one of only 3 boroughs in London, I think it highlights just the amount of work that's gone into the officers delivering these in very, very tight conditions. And equally, having them only £100 comparative leaves you space that would previously in some circumstances cost double-digit thousands of pounds, and allowing them for longer periods of time brings its own elements in regards to disruption for residents through antisocial behaviour, increased littering, street drinking. So we've been quite stringent with pavement licence being smoke-free. We're one of the first boroughs to introduce that. I know that's going to end up becoming more of a manifesto commitment potentially in the next administration. We were one of the first to also implement a regular review after 3 months, as opposed to the full 12 months, utilising the legislation itself to enable feedback from society, from residents, from other businesses around any kind of negative activity, and be able to review those. And we have, when needed, taken action to revoke those licences or put in place additional conditions to manage negative behaviours.
Thank you, that's very helpful. Alan, then I want to bring in Councillor Smith. Go on.
Yeah, I just want to quickly add, if you walk around Westminster, you will notice the Westminster City Council, and I've talked to my colleagues down in Westminster, have had to learn some really nasty lessons from rolling out on Soho and Charlotte Street in particular, and the amount of antisocial behaviour and the complaints they receive from local residents. So I think the approach we've done in Hackney has been, there's a presumption in favour allowing al fresco dining unless there is a table and chairs on pavements, unless there is a serious risk that it obstructs the pavement from disabled or people with prams, or adds to antisocial behaviour, or it impedes emergency vehicles. So there is a presumption in favour, but we've taken a really pragmatic approach. But if there's any of those objections, we will not support them. And I'm afraid you may have heard from some businesses who have not had approval to do that, but those are being not being granted on pretty strong grounds.
Thank you. You're going to come back in.
It was just on the licences. Just to note on the licences themselves, when with the documentation that we provide, we look at, and it's included in the hyperlinks in the report that you can see our al fresco documentation. Ours is very much a guidance tool that takes businesses through a journey of their different options, whether that be a shopfront licence and a different approach to that, or whether it be a pavement licence. And if you compare that to some of the documents created by Westminster or other boroughs, they were very technical documents, very clunky, mechanical, that weren't actually supportive of those businesses and accelerated them into trading and trading in an environment that wasn't negative to its current residents or sustainable businesses next to them. And if you look at the licences we hold now, I think we have the second least amount of complaints of all the other boroughs in regards to our al fresco dining piece, and the feedback we've had from businesses we've been able to incorporate into the document and keep it going, rolling and updated over the pandemic. This has been one of the really useful tools to help them navigate some of the challenges that they face.
Thank you, that's great. I'm just going to bring Councillor Smith in as the last question for this evening. Councillor Smith.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I'll be brief. Just on the anaerobic digestion that you mentioned, Chair, earlier on in regards to food waste. in venues and licensing. I was wondering if we could ask the council to maybe think about investing in anaerobic digestion and make it part of Hackney Light and Power, so that we then basically supply lower carbon gas and reduce dependence on supplies from Russia, for example. And the other one was the Hackney Night's sustainability factor. Did you mention, Alan, there was about 30% of businesses that are kind of engaged with that? Is that correct? Something like that.
No, 30% reduction in the levy if they're accredited whether the businesses are on.
Yeah. Just in general terms, in regards to sort of single-use plastic, I'm on the licensing committee, and I've been asking for an advisory note to go on all kind of licenses that are kind of given to just suggest that they don't use single-use plastics, for example. Now, I know the portal deals with sustainability issues now, and Samantha sent me through a great big list of things that's on there. I think it's great. Do you think it might be possible, is it legally possible to put an advisory note on every single application that gets accepted, just to say, to highlight the sustainable issues, essentially?
Thanks, Councillor Smith. This is your final question for the evening. Anaerobic digestion and single-use plastics advisories on the licence applications.
We can certainly look at it. We need to know the capital revenue cost, but we may even have room for it in buildings. But that's something I'll raise with the cabinet member, Councillor Coban. Something we would support, but it needs on the cost implications. And in terms of putting an advisory on licensing approvals, yes, that's easily doable. What we're trying to do is another step in forward and make it a requirement of the licenses by putting it in with some of the other sustainability initiatives we're putting in terms of net zero. So we're definitely looking at that at the moment.
And can I also say, as a follow-up to that, it's all very well banning single-use plastics. It's actually much more of a technical and policy challenge to find a viable alternative, both particularly for small and medium-sized businesses. So let's make sure that we are enabling rather than dictating things which could have unintended consequences for residents and indeed businesses when dealing with these things. I'm just trying to wrap up and thank our evidence givers again for their very detailed and helpful evidence this evening to the Commission. We'll be looking forward for follow-ups, particularly on the economic stock take, and looking for some recommendations as to how the nighttime economy support might go forward, bearing in mind the comparative bounce back, but where there might be trends underneath that we need to reveal and work out how we as a council need to shape that economy in the future. But thanks again to everybody for all of your hard work. I think I'm now on final stretch. I remember that we have a couple of other items. It's just to approve the work programme. This is of course the final meeting. Oh, I'm sorry, Councillor Thomas, you had your hand up.
I did, but I think our latest covered a bit of what I want to add around terms and the sustainability, so I'm fine.
Are you happy?
Yes.
I'm sorry.
You were running. It's 10 past already. I'm fine.
You're happy. I'm just when you have the cabinet lead here, it's normally a good idea to hear from the cabinet lead. But you're broadly speaking in line with on the 10 stuff and on the sustainability. Right. So we have our work programme, which I say is the last one for this year. We look forward to regathering after the elections in May. We do not have minutes of the previous meeting. They will be approved again in the new session in May. And we don't think I have any other business. So in that case, I can declare the meeting closed. Thanks very much, everybody. Good night.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks.